I didn't realize my children had stopped asking how I was until one quiet evening when I hung up the phone and noticed something that hadn't crossed my mind before. For almost 20 minutes, my son had talked about his work, his car, and a small problem with his neighbor. I had listened the way parents always do, offering the occasional, "That sounds frustrating," or, "I'm sure it'll work out." When the call ended, I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat there for a moment. And then I realized something strange. He hadn't asked me a single question. Not one. Not how my day had been. Not how I was feeling. Not even the simple question people used to ask automatically. "How are you, Dad?" My name is Walter. I'm 72 years old, and I live in the same house where my children grew up. It's a modest place on a quiet street with a small front yard and a maple tree that has stood in the corner of the property longer than I have. In the fall, its leaves cover the driveway in shades of orange and gold. When my children were young, that tree was part of everything. They used to climb it, tie swings to its branches, hide behind it when they played games in the yard. Back then, the house felt like the center of a busy little world. There were always voices somewhere in the house. Footsteps on the stairs. The sound of doors opening and closing. Arguments about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. Laughter coming from the living room late at night. When you're raising children, the noise can feel overwhelming sometimes. But once it disappears, you realize it was the sound of life. I have 2 children. My daughter, Emily, and my son, Jason. Emily is the older one. She was always thoughtful, even as a child. The kind of kid who asked questions about everything and paid attention to details most people missed. Jason was different. More energetic. The type of boy who couldn't sit still for long and always seemed to be building something or taking something apart. Growing up, they were close. They shared secrets, argued about silly things, and sometimes teamed up against me when they thought I was being unfair about curfews or chores. Looking back now, those years feel like another lifetime. When Emily left for college, the house felt quieter for the first time. Jason followed 3 years later. After that, the house became something I had to get used to all over again. At first, I worried the silence would feel unbearable. But life has a way of filling quiet spaces with routine. I kept the same habits. Morning coffee at the kitchen table. Walking around the neighborhood in the afternoon. Watching the evening news before bed. And for a long time, my children stayed connected to that routine in small ways. Emily called often in those early years after she moved away. Sometimes twice a week. Jason visited more frequently because he stayed in the same city. When they called, the conversations usually started the same way. "Hi, Dad. How are you?" That question seems simple. But when you hear it from your children, it carries something more. It means they're thinking about you. It means they still see you as part of their world. For years, those words were a normal part of our conversations. But slowly, almost without me noticing, something began to change. The phone calls became less frequent. Not dramatically at first. Just small changes. Emily's calls dropped from twice a week to once every couple of weeks. Jason stopped dropping by unexpectedly after work. Whenever we did talk, the conversations began to feel different. They started quickly. "Hey Dad, I only have a minute." Or, "I'm driving, but I wanted to tell you something." Then they would start talking about whatever had happened in their lives. Emily would describe problems at work or plans for the weekend. Jason would talk about his kids' school activities or repairs he needed to make around his house. I listened carefully, the way I always had. But slowly, something familiar disappeared from those conversations. The questions. Not all at once. Just little by little. At first, I didn't think much about it. People get busy. Life becomes complicated. When you're younger, your days are filled with responsibilities that leave little room for long conversations. So I didn't take it personally. But the pattern continued. Months passed where every phone call followed the same rhythm. They talked. I listened. Then the call ended. Sometimes I realized afterward that we had spent 20 minutes discussing their lives without mentioning mine even once. The strange thing is, I didn't feel angry about it. Not exactly. What I felt was something quieter. Something harder to explain. A small sense of fading into the background. Like a photograph slowly losing its color. One afternoon last spring, I was sitting on the back porch when Emily called. The weather was warm enough that the air smelled faintly like freshly cut grass. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. Emily sounded cheerful when she answered. "Hi, Dad." We talked for a while about her work and a vacation she and her husband were planning. She told me about a new restaurant they had discovered near their apartment. Then she mentioned a small problem she was dealing with at work. I listened and gave the kind of advice parents usually offer. Sometimes things feel worse in the moment than they really are. I told her. "I guess you're right," she said. A few minutes later she said she had to go. "Okay, Dad, I'll talk to you soon." After we hung up, I sat there on the porch thinking about the conversation. And once again I realized something. She hadn't asked how I was doing. Not once. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It settled slowly, like a quiet truth you can't quite ignore anymore. I began paying closer attention to the conversations that followed. The next time Jason called, I noticed the same pattern. He started talking immediately about a problem with his car. "I think the transmission might be going," he said. We spent 15 minutes discussing mechanics and repair shops. Then he said he had to go pick up his daughter from soccer practice. "Talk to you later, Dad." The call ended. Again, no questions. That was the moment I finally admitted something to myself. My children had stopped asking how I was. The realization wasn't dramatic. There were no angry words, no arguments. Just a quiet understanding. Somewhere along the way, the balance in our conversations had shifted. When they were young, I had been the center of their world. Now I had become something different. A safe place to talk. A listener. A voice on the other end of the phone. And perhaps that was enough for them. But that evening, something happened that made me understand the situation more clearly. Jason called again. This time the conversation followed the same familiar pattern. He talked about work, about his kids, about a neighbor who had parked too close to his driveway. After 20 minutes, there was a pause. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, almost casually, I asked a question. "Jason," I said. "Yeah? When was the last time you asked how I was doing?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. I guess I didn't realize I hadn't," he said. "I know you didn't," I replied. That conversation changed something between us. Not dramatically. But enough. The next time he called, the first thing he said was something I hadn't heard in a long time. "Hey, Dad. How are you doing today?" It was such a simple sentence. But hearing it again felt strangely important. These days, my children still get busy. They still call with problems or stories from their lives. But every once in a while, they pause and ask the question that reminds me they're still thinking about me. "How are you?" And I've learned something important about family through all of this. Children don't stop caring about their parents. Sometimes they simply forget that parents grow older, quieter, and more reflective with time. Sometimes they forget that the people who spent years asking about their lives still need someone to ask about theirs. But a gentle reminder can bring that awareness back. And when it does, those small questions begin to feel meaningful again. Because at this stage of life, the simplest words can carry the greatest comfort. "How are you?" might only be 4 words. But sometimes, it's all a parent needs to hear.